What if the woman you humiliated at work turned out to own the company before the day ended? One cruel laugh, one careless insult, one moment of arrogance. That would cost them everything. Stay with us, because what's about to happen will shatter every illusion you ever had about who truly holds the power. The glass doors of Sterling & Co. swung open with a mechanical hiss as Elena Carter stepped inside, her worn leather tote slung over one shoulder, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floors that gleamed like a shrine to wealth. She wore a simple navy blouse, slacks that had seen too many seasons, and flats scuffed at the edges. Nothing about her screamed status, power, or ambition, and that alone was enough to draw the first looks. The first curling sneers hidden behind manicured hands and gleaming coffee cups. Near the reception desk, two assistants leaned toward each other, whispering sharply as their eyes raked over Elena from head to toe, their lips twisting in amusement, their voices slicing through the morning hum of conversation. "She still works here," one murmured, stifling a laugh. "I thought we upgraded the staff." The receptionist, perched behind a marble counter too grand for its purpose, barely concealed her smirk as Elena offered a polite good morning. She didn't respond, simply returned to scrolling on her phone, dismissing Elena without a second thought. As she moved toward the elevator bank, the sea of power suits and designer heels parted slightly, not out of respect, but out of an unspoken collective judgment, a silent message vibrating through the pristine air: "You don't belong here." Elena pressed the button for the 35th floor, her heart pounding harder than it should have for a woman who had done this 1,000 times before. But today the looks lingered longer, the whispers floated closer, sharper, more poisonous, and as the elevator doors slid closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, small, ordinary, invisible in a world that worshipped polish and pretension. She adjusted her tote, lifting her chin just a fraction higher, willing herself to breathe, to push through the invisible walls tightening around her. But deep down, a cold knot twisted in her stomach, because she knew today was going to be worse than all the others. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 35th floor, and the moment Elena stepped out, the air seemed to shift, tightening like an invisible noose around her neck. Conversations dipped, then resumed with exaggerated volume, laughter sharp and pointed, as eyes flicked toward her with thinly veiled disdain. She moved through the maze of glass-walled offices and sleek communal desks, her sensible shoes making no sound on the carpet, but it didn't matter. Her presence was enough to draw scorn like a magnet, a ripple of cruelty following her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Near the marketing division, a group of junior executives, dressed in polished suits 2 sizes too tight with ambition, leaned together and let their voices carry, too loud to be accidental. "She looks like she raided a thrift store," one said, snickering behind a manicured hand. "Maybe she thinks hard work makes up for everything else," another added, her laughter brittle, echoing against the sterile glass walls. Elena's face burned, but she kept moving, her hands tightening around the strap of her tote until her knuckles blanched, every muscle in her body screaming to turn around, to flee, to escape the invisible knives slicing into her from every direction. She slid into her cubicle, a tiny, windowless corner shoved between the supply closet and the janitor's hallway, and tried to disappear. But even here, the whispers found her. A pair of interns strutted past, deliberately loud, one muttering, "Maybe if I dress like I'm broke, I'll get sympathy points too," and the other bursting into cruel, wheezing laughter. Elena focused on her computer screen, blinking against the hot sting behind her eyes, willing herself to breathe, to endure. But it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with trembling hands. Just before the morning meeting, she heard the final, slicing blow. Her supervisor, Mr. Dane, striding past her desk with a mug in hand, muttering to a colleague, "Honestly, I don't even know why she's still here. Dead weight slows everyone down." The words didn't stab. They carved, deep, slow, merciless. Elena sat frozen, hands trembling just slightly over her keyboard, her heart hammering hollowly against her ribs, every atom inside her screaming that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she proved herself, she would never be enough for them. Not because of what she did, but because of what they had already decided she was forgettable, disposable, invisible. And in that moment, deep beneath the shame and the ache, something ancient and quiet stirred. A silent, coiled storm that would not stay sleeping for long. The conference room was a glass box perched high above the city, sunlight streaming mercilessly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating every flaw, every crack, every secret smile of mockery as Elena slipped into the last empty chair near the back, clutching her worn notebook like a shield. Around her, polished executives lounged in their tailored suits and designer heels, their laughter low and vicious. The kind of laughter that thrives on cruelty and crumbles when confronted by truth. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Mr. Dane, her supervisor, his smile thin and razor-edged as he tapped a pen against a stack of performance charts. "Let's talk about productivity," he announced, his voice slicing through the hum of conversation. And immediately, Elena felt the shift, eyes narrowing, bodies leaning forward, the air thickening with the anticipation of blood. Dane flipped to a slide projected against the glass wall. A graph that plunged downward at an alarming angle, bright red against the sterile blue background. "Some departments," he said, his tone dripping with false concern, "seem to be carrying more than their fair share of dead weight." Snickers rippled through the room like wildfire. Elena sat frozen, a cold sweat breaking across her skin. She knew what was coming. "Take, for example," Dane said, turning his shark's grin directly toward her. "Employees who seem incapable of adapting, incapable of delivering results, incapable of even dressing appropriately to represent the standards of this company." Gasps, quickly stifled, fluttered around the table. A few brave souls openly smirked. Someone near the front actually clapped once before thinking better of it. Elena's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, but she refused to look down, refused to shrink, even as humiliation burned her from the inside out. "We must ask ourselves," Dane continued, pacing with exaggerated thoughtfulness, "how long can an organization sustain such dead weight before it drags us all down?" His words were a noose, tightening with every syllable, and though he never spoke her name, every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto Elena. Accusing, dismissing, already erasing. She opened her mouth once, then closed it, the words dying before they could even be born. Because what could she say that would matter to them? They had already decided she was nothing. Laughter simmered beneath the surface like a disease, waiting to break out. Elena gripped the edges of her notebook so tightly the corners bent under her fingers, her whole body trembling with a rage so fierce it made her dizzy, a grief so deep it hollowed her out from the inside. And just when she thought she might shatter into 1,000 invisible pieces, just when the last shred of her dignity was about to be stripped away, the heavy conference room doors slammed open with a force that rattled the glass walls, and the storm she had tried so hard to contain was no longer just inside her. It had arrived, in flesh and blood, in tailored black and cold fury, and it was coming for them all. The heavy conference doors crashed open with a reverberating boom that sucked the breath from the room, every head snapping toward the intrusion as if pulled by an invisible force. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh light of the hallway, was a man whose mere presence seemed to bend the air around him, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a custom black suit that whispered obscene wealth with every measured movement. And his eyes, sharp as cut steel, locked immediately onto Elena, softening for a fraction of a heartbeat, before hardening into something lethal as they shifted to the crowd that had just tried to dismantle her. Gasps tore through the room as recognition rippled outward like shockwaves. A name hissed across the conference table in panicked whispers. Alexander Ward. A name that didn't just command attention, it owned it. A name that sent CEOs scrambling, that reshaped markets overnight, that destroyed enemies without lifting more than a single, well-placed word. "Mr." Dane stuttered, color draining from his face faster than water from a shattered glass. "Mr. Ward," he spluttered, taking a step back instinctively, hands trembling slightly as he struggled to regain his fake smile. We weren't expecting you." Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked forward with slow, terrifying control, the air around him thickening with a pressure that made the very glass walls seem to hum with tension. He stopped beside Elena's chair, placed a protective hand gently on her shoulder. An unmistakable gesture that spoke volumes in a language no amount of corporate arrogance could misunderstand, then turned his cold, merciless gaze back to the room. "I came," he said, voice low and razor-edged, "because I heard whispers that certain individuals in this company, individuals I now own, have forgotten the meaning of respect." His words slammed into the stunned room like hammer blows, each syllable deliberate, each pause calculated to tighten the noose around their necks. "As of this morning," Alexander continued, pulling a slim folder from his inner jacket pocket and tossing it onto the table with a sharp snap, "Sterling & Co. is officially under my control. Every executive contract, every department, every decision now falls under my personal jurisdiction." Dead silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Mr. Dane opened his mouth again, desperate, fumbling for words that would not come. But Alexander cut him off with a single look that could have frozen fire. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice a velvet-covered blade. "There will be changes, starting with those who believed they could humiliate my wife and walk away unscathed." He turned slightly toward Elena, his hand tightening just briefly on her shoulder. "An anchor, a shield, a vow. You didn't just insult an employee today," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried across every inch of the room. "You insulted the woman I love, and that is a mistake you will never recover from." The weight of Alexander's final words hung in the air like a blade suspended by a fraying thread, and before anyone could gather their wits enough to protest, he flicked open the folder on the table with a casualness that was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. Neatly stacked inside were signed acquisition papers, shareholder approvals, and, chillingly, a detailed list of terminations. Names typed in cold, clinical font, each one a death sentence for a career built on cruelty and arrogance. Alexander's hand moved with surgical precision as he withdrew the list and read aloud, his voice devoid of emotion, each name a final toll of the bell. "Dane Whitmore, effective immediately. Your contract is terminated for gross misconduct and failure to maintain a respectful work environment. Security will escort you out." The room convulsed with a collective, strangled gasp. Dane's mouth opened and closed like a fish desperate for air, his face flushing deep red, then ghostly pale as two imposing security officers materialized at the back of the room as if summoned by invisible strings, moving forward with unhurried certainty. Jessica Marks, marketing coordinator, Brendan Liu, junior VP, Sandra Cooper, HR manager. Alexander's voice was relentless, a litany of judgment carved into the sterile air. All terminated, effective immediately. Your severance packages have been revoked under breach of ethics clauses you so thoughtfully ignored. One by one, the laughing faces, the whispering mouths, the sneering eyes that had turned against Elena crumbled into open horror, into pleading, into pathetic scrambling for excuses that no longer mattered. One woman burst into sobs, clutching her Louis Vuitton handbag like it could shield her from the reckoning bearing down upon her. A man stammered apologies that dissolved into incoherent whimpers before he was escorted out by security, his dignity stripped clean away. Alexander's eyes, cold and pitiless, surveyed the devastation with the detached efficiency of a surgeon excising rot from a body worth saving. "This company," he said, pacing slowly around the conference room, his steps measured, deliberate, "will be rebuilt from the ground up, with people who understand that respect is not a courtesy. It's a requirement." His gaze returned to Elena, and for a brief, searing moment, his voice softened. Just enough for her and only her. And it will be a place where character matters more than appearances. He straightened, slipping the termination list back into the folder with a final, echoing snap. "Consider this a lesson," he said, addressing the stunned, silent survivors left in the room, on the dangers of underestimating someone who doesn't wear their power like armor. The old Sterling & Co. had died the moment Alexander Ward had walked through those doors, but its final breath, the sound of arrogance shattering, still echoed in the air, unforgettable, undeniable, and irreversible. The folder snapped shut with a sound that seemed to reverberate through every bone in the room, and then Alexander simply nodded once, a subtle signal. But to those still standing, it might as well have been a gunshot. The security team, black-suited and expressionless, moved with the silent efficiency of an execution squad, descending on the named employees without hesitation. Dane Whitmore tried to protest, sputtering about misunderstandings, loyalty, years of service, but his words evaporated into thin air as a guard gently but firmly guided him toward the door, his frantic protests echoing down the hallway like the cries of a dethroned tyrant. Jessica Marks clutched at her Hermes scarf, as if it could shield her from the judgment bearing down on her, tears streaking her carefully contoured makeup as she was stripped of her ID badge and escorted out like a criminal. Brendan Liu tried to make a last desperate call on his phone, but a security officer plucked it from his hand with cold efficiency, dropping it into a sealed evidence bag without a word. All around the room, the proud, the petty, the powerful who thought they were invincible collapsed into chaos, their downfall unfolding not in shouts or violence, but in cold, methodical precision. Boxes were handed out, desks were cleaned under the watchful eyes of security, emails were locked, key cards disabled, reputations shredded with a few taps on a keyboard. It was over before many of them could even process it, their power stripped away in minutes, leaving only the hollow wreckage of arrogance exposed to the sterile light of the office they once ruled. Elena stood still through it all, her hands at her sides, her face calm, her eyes unwavering. She didn't need to lift a finger, didn't need to speak, because the man beside her was rewriting the story they had tried to write for her. Not with anger, but with justice. Alexander watched dispassionately as the last of the guilty were let out, their sobs and desperate apologies trailing behind them like the smoke of a dying fire. He turned to the remaining employees, those who had said nothing, those who had laughed nervously but not cruelly, those who had hesitated, and was in and for them, there was a different kind of silence, not full of terror, but of heavy, reflective gravity. "Remember this day," Alexander said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the glass walls themselves. "Not because you lost your colleagues, but because you nearly lost yourselves." With that, he placed a hand gently at the small of Elena's back, guiding her forward, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a queen returning to claim the respect she had always deserved. And as they walked through the broken remains of Sterling & Co., there was no applause, no cheers, only the stunned, aching silence of a kingdom falling, and the first tremors of a new one being built in its place. When the last echoes of departing footsteps faded into nothingness, a new kind of silence filled the conference room, not one born of fear, but of something heavier, something more sacred, the silence of reckoning. Alexander turned his gaze slowly, methodically, toward the few employees who remained. The ones who had not laughed, who had not sneered, who had offered small mercies that once seemed invisible, but now shone like beacons in the wreckage of arrogance. He moved first to a quiet young woman near the end of the table. Sophie Lynn, an assistant barely out of college, who had once stayed late to help Elena carry a stack of heavy reports when no one else even noticed. She sat trembling now, hands clutched in her lap, expecting perhaps that even goodness would not be enough to shield her. Alexander's voice cut through the tension, low but clear. "Sophie Lynn," he said, and she flinched before lifting her wide, fearful eyes to his. "You showed kindness when you had nothing to gain from it," he continued, a faint warmth threading into his voice. And that is the currency upon which real empires are built. He placed a crisp white envelope on the table in front of her. An offer letter, promotion, salary tripled, full sponsorship for executive training. Sophie gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth as tears flooded her eyes. But Alexander had already turned, already moving on. Next was David Tran, a junior IT analyst who had once quietly reset Elena's login when others forgot to help, who had placed an extra cup of coffee on her desk the day the whispers grew too loud. For him, a seat on the new leadership team, immediate promotion, full benefits for his family. He stood frozen, disbelief etched across his face, unable to find words as Alexander simply nodded once, an unspoken acknowledgement of loyalty repaid, person by person, moment by moment. Alexander. And Elena, by his side, her presence growing larger and brighter with each step, rewrote the rules of the world they had been forced to survive. No longer would cruelty be rewarded. No longer would decency be invisible. Every small kindness, every quiet act of humanity that had once seemed meaningless was now honored, celebrated, lifted high in front of those who had thought mockery was strength. And as Sophie and David and the others stood blinking in the brilliant light of unexpected hope, a single truth became clear to everyone, left standing in a world obsessed with appearances. It was kindness, silent, inconvenient, unseen, that had become the most valuable currency of all. The conference room, once a temple to arrogance and silent cruelty, now stood quiet, reverent, the air thick with something heavier than fear, something closer to awakening. Alexander turned to Elena, his hand falling away in a silent gesture that said everything without speaking. This moment was hers. For a heartbeat, she stood still, her simple navy blouse rumpled from the long day, her worn shoes planted firmly on the marble floor that had once seemed so far beneath her. And then she stepped forward, her presence growing, expanding, filling the cavernous space with a force no one could deny. She didn't need a podium, didn't need a microphone. When she spoke, her voice was steady, strong, vibrating with a power born not of anger, but of surviving every moment they thought would break her. "I was never invisible," Elena said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of those who remained. "You just chose not to see me." Her words hit like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward, shattering the last illusions of superiority clinging to the corners of the room. "You measured me by the brand of my shoes, the thread count of my clothes, the shine on my handbag," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, each syllable a blow against the crumbling facade they had built. "And when I didn't meet your expectations, you dismissed me. Mungkin not because I wasn't capable, not because I wasn't worthy, but because you refused to look beyond the surface." She paused, letting the truth settle, heavy and undeniable, before delivering the final strike. "Worth," she said, her voice soft but lethal, "is not something you can wear. It is something you carry. It is built in the quiet hours when no one is watching. It is forged in patience, in perseverance, in the choice to remain kind in a world that tells you it's weakness." Eyes that once sneered now blinked back tears. Hands that once pointed in mockery now twisted nervously in lapse. Hearts that once beat with smug superiority now ached with the weight of what they had lost, what they had never seen. Elena's hand curled lightly into a fist at her side, not in anger, but in triumph. "I did not need to change to earn your respect," she said, her voice ringing clear through the glass and steel. "You needed to change to see it." She looked toward Sophie, toward David, toward every soul who had offered her a piece of their humanity when it cost them nothing and earned them nothing, and she smiled. Small, fierce, unbreakable. And for those who choose to see, she finished. The future is wide open. Then she stepped back, not because she was finished, but because the message was already carved into the bones of the building, stitched into the very walls, a testimony written not in rage, but in something infinitely stronger. Undeniable self-worth. The room remained frozen long after Elena's final words faded into the heavy, reverent silence. a silence not born of defeat, but of something deeper. The slow, painful birth of understanding. She didn't wait for applause, didn't crave validation. She simply turned, her steps sure and unhurried, crossing the vast, gleaming floor with Alexander at her side, his hand finding hers with a tenderness that needed no words. Together they walked past the rows of glass-walled offices, past the desks that had once been stages for whispered mockery and stolen laughter, past the faces that now stared at them, not with arrogance, but with awe, and outside the floor to ceiling windows. The city stretched wide and brilliant under the setting sun, a living canvas of possibilities waiting to be claimed. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Elena stepped inside without hesitation, her reflection in the mirrored walls no longer small, no longer muted, but whole, radiant, untouchable. As the doors closed behind them, sealing off the echoes of a chapter they had burned to ash, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years, a breath that carried away every bitter word, every sneer, every invisible wound, leaving only peace, deep, pure, and final. The descent was smooth, weightless, like being freed from chains she no longer even remembered fastening. When they reached the ground floor, Alexander led her through the marble lobby where security guards and receptionists alike stood frozen, watching, understanding without needing to be told that something irreversible had just happened. Outside, the city breathed with them, vibrant and golden, the future yawning open at their feet. Alexander turned to her, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles, his smile small but fierce. "Where to next, Mrs. Ward?" he asked, and for the first time in a very long time, Elena smiled back without hesitation, without fear, her voice steady and filled with the certainty of a woman who had reclaimed her own story. "Anywhere," she said, her eyes shining. "Everywhere." And as they stepped out into the dying light, hand in hand, the past crumbled behind them like a city abandoned to ruin, and ahead, stretched out like an endless road, was the life they would build. Not from appearances, not from power, but from truth, from dignity, from the quiet, invincible kind of strength that no humiliation, no cruelty, no world obsessed with image could ever take away again. Long after the city swallowed them into its glowing arteries, long after the elevators fell silent and the laughter that once filled Sterling and Co. rotted into memory, one truth remained, echoing louder than the fall of any empire built on arrogance. You never know the battles someone carries behind a simple smile. You never know the fire burning quietly behind modest shoes and a humble jacket. You never know the kingdom hidden behind ordinary eyes until it is too late to kneel. They had mocked her because it was easy, because it made them feel bigger, safer, invincible. But in doing so, they had revealed the poverty of their own souls. Because real power does not dress for your approval. Real strength does not beg for your validation. Real greatness does not need to announce itself. Or it simply waits, watches, endures, until the day it rises, and when it does, no wall of cruelty, no fortress of pride, no currency of shallow respect can stand against it. Elena Carter had never needed their acceptance to be powerful. She had always been powerful because she carried something they could never touch. Dignity that did not crumble under humiliation, worth that did not bleed under ridicule, and a love so fierce it moved mountains in silence. Judge less, look deeper, and when faced with someone who does not shine the way you expect, remember Elena. Remember what it cost them to laugh. Remember what it gave her to endure. And choose better. Choose to see. She didn't fight back with rage. She didn't need to shout. She simply stood, and let the truth speak louder than any humiliation. Remember this. True strength doesn't sparkle in the spotlight. It survives in silence, and rises when no one is ready. Judge less. Love deeper. Because the next nobody you mock may be the soul powerful enough to change your entire world.